Support for this podcast comes from Is Business Broken, a podcast from BU Questrom School of Business. A recent episode looks at how to solve big antitrust problems like common ownership. Stick around until the end of this podcast for a preview.
WBUR Podcasts, Boston.
I'm Daryl C. Murphy, and you're listening to The Comment. So lately, we've been hearing more stories in the news about censorship and freedom of expression. More recently, students in the U.S. with green cards or visas have been threatened with or detained for deportation because of their views on U.S. support for Israel's military assault in Gaza. And in public schools around the country, lawmakers have limited how teachers can discuss race and gender in the classroom. These are just two examples that demonstrate how freedom of expression only goes so far for some in our communities. But one way or another, people tend to find a way to express themselves and get their point across. And that brings me to today's episode, which is about zines.
The Zines is a self-made, small circulating magazine that's self-distributed and sold either in person or through the mail. That's a basic definition. It can be any size. It can be about any subject that you want. It can really be anything that you want it to be. And it's open to anyone to sort of join zine culture.
Yeah.
So, yeah, and anyone should make a zine if they want to.
Just get started, right?
Yeah.
Just get some blank sheets of paper and go, right?
Yeah.
That's children's librarian and zine enthusiast Chris Strunk. He oversees part of the Boston Public Library's zine collection at its Jamaica Plain branch, one of 6 participating branches. You can find zines that cover topics from bread making to queerness to local history. In fact, the zine collection was his idea.
It took a long time. It's something that I was interested in doing since I started here, like in along to October 2000. But then eventually, 2.5 years ago, they were like, yes, you can do this. A wonderful cataloger named Kelly Webster, who's really, really into mini comics and was excited about getting mini comics into the library. And Kelly handled the technical side of everything, which I couldn't have done by myself.
What is it exactly about zines that made you want to have it?
Well, first of all, I just think there's really incredible work being done in the area of zines. I've always thought that. I mean, I got into zines when I was in high school through getting involved in like punk rock, and there's a lot of zine culture in punk rock. Riot Girl zines, that was like a big political awakening for me.
Yeah.
As a teenager, like getting those zines in the mail and then reading about feminism that way. And also, since I'm like 50, at that point it was pre-internet, so to find out about what was going on and find out what new records were coming out and stuff, you had to read zines. And that led to just not reading music zines, but all the zines that were available then. Someone like Aaron Comet Bus, I think, is like as good a writer as anyone that we have.
Who?
Aaron Comet Bus, or Aaron Elliott, which is really his real name. He's run a long-running zine called Comet Bus since like the 80s.
Okay.
It was initially a music zine, but then it started being about traveling across the country on Greyhound buses and became kind of more of like a personal thing. But it's somebody I thought who's like one of the greatest writers ever. So I wanted to make his writings available in the library for the public to check out.
Can you like talk about like the diversity of the zine scene here?
Oh,
I'm going to try not to say that too much. But
it's a medium that marginalized people use.
Yeah.
Marginalized communities use a lot to get their opinions out and to talk to each other.
Yeah.
In a way that's sort of not traceable on the internet. But since it's paper, it's almost can feel like an American samizdat or something like that at times. But like
American what?
Like samizdat in like the Soviet Union, the official channels weren't like available to go through for people that wanted to talk to each other about things, for novels and music and things like that. So it was like making copies and giving them to people, and those people make copies and give them to people. The third reason that I wanted to get the zines into the library were there's a lot of like reference kind of stuff that's in zines that there aren't even books about. Like, can I pick up the zine that's over here, How to Support Your Non-Binary Family Members? There might not be a book about that, but there are zines about it. So, and one of the highest circulating zines, it's a series done by Microcosm called like UNF. I don't know if I can say the word, but our highest circulating zine actually is UNF Your Burnout, which is in this series, but it's a good, straightforward, like
self-help.
They're good for reference for things that we might not actually have books about.
Let's take a look at the collection.
Okay.
Let's start with your fave.
My fave. This is a zine called Beta Decay. I guess we would call it like weird stories or weird science fiction stories. I think the stories in there are so good that I was like, this guy should have a book deal, but I don't. He kind of retired. He actually because I like them so much. I reached out to him and he actually made more copies so that could be in the library.
This is like a little book. Yeah.
Yeah.
The library has zines from all over the country for patrons to check out, but it also has a ton of local creators in its collection as well. We asked Chris to point out a few of his favorites.
There's a local sex education and sex positive group that does a lot of activities, but one of their main things is they make zines for sex education, and they're called Pleasure Pie, and they have a bunch of great zines out. So
I think I heard of them.
I'd also highlight Lavender Menace Press, run by Abby Neal. They do a lot of like queer zines.
Lavender Menace.
There's one that we found out about because they submitted their zine for us to purchase, which we did. It's a zine called Doomed, and the address that came from is Lawrence, and the people who do it are anonymous. It's like an urban exploration zine where they're like crawling through tunnels at night and climbing cranes, and it's mostly photography with some writing. Tim Devon's zines, he lives in Somerville.
Tim Devon?
Yeah, Free the Future Press. He's done a lot of research into the countercultural history of Boston. And he's made some amazing zines over the years, but this is one about 55 Norfolk Street.
So it's a zine with a pink cover, and it says, come take a tour of Cambridge's creative and political underground without ever leaving 55 Norfolk Street by Tim Devon.
Yep.
Magical Spaces, number 2.
Yes. So Magical Spaces, number 1 was written by me. It was like
oh, yeah?
You could never actually have a complete list, but it's every illegal space punk shows happened in Boston between 2000 and 2015 that I could remember.
That's cool. So you were in a punk band, you were running around smashing, having a good time?
Sure. I mean, I still am in a punk band, but yeah. So
nice.
But yeah.
What's the name of the band?
Intensive Care Unit.
Intensive Care Unit. Nice,
So,
nice.
yeah.
You gotta check it out. Maybe
All right,
put it in the
awesome.
episode.
Great.
Should have seen the writing on the wall. Tried to take a stand, but you'd only take a fall.
We're gonna take a break, but when we get back, we're gonna talk more about the history of zines and why folks are returning to zine making more and more. We'll be right back.
I see you, I see you, I see you, I see you, I see you.
Support for this podcast comes from Is Business Broken, a podcast from BU Questrom School of Business. Common ownership is when major investors buy significant stakes across competing firms, which can lower competition, raise prices, and affect innovation.
Antitrust is exactly a situation where the markets don't quite work.
A recent episode dives into potential solutions. Follow wherever you get your podcasts and stick around until the end of this podcast for a preview of the episode.
Pay attention! I'll get to stepping.
We're back with Boston Public Library children's librarian, Chris Strunk. After checking out the collection, we sat down with Chris to talk more about the radical history of zines.
There was an explosion of zines around punk, which makes it kind of rooted in punk culture. But I think you can draw a line from self-published like poetry in the Harlem Renaissance through science fiction fanzines of the 30s, through beatniks and self-produced like poetry journals. I mean, somebody like D.A. Levy in Cleveland, who's a poet who self-published a lot of his own things, through like the underground newspapers in the 60s to the early like rock zines of the 70s, sort of like Backdoor Man and Bomp. And then you have the punk explosion. And then there was also in the 80s, Fact Sheet 5 was just a zine that reviewed other zines, but they reviewed thousands of zines, and so much like networking happened through that, and it just kind of exploded.
Yeah.
And I think 90s may have been the height of zine culture till now. I would say when the internet came in the early 2000s, things kind of dried up a little bit. I mean, people just, you may have done a zine, we're doing like a live journal or something like that instead. In the past like 5 to 6 years, there has really been kind of an explosion again. I think it is like with the internet becoming less useful as it like gets worse and worse. I think people are turning to zines, and I think just people like to have something tangible, and they like to like work with paper and pens.
And now there's this resurgence happening.
The resurgence,
right?
yeah. I think There's still music zines. There's a lot of those. I think more than ever now, I think there's a lot of zines being made by like sort of marginalized cultures like LGBTQ and other minorities. I mean, that did definitely happen before, but it's almost as if they've taken zines over. So even, which is a good thing.
What do you think zines can offer us now that TikTok or Instagram can't?
But first of all, we've talked about this before, Anita, but zines are untraceable. They don't leave a digital footprint. So if you're worried about your digital privacy, zines are definitely a way to get information out. There's more noise on the internet than ever. And I do think part of the zine revival in the past couple of years is because of that. Like people are just like, oh, this used to be good for communicating with people, but it feels like sketchy and bad. So so and it feels better to return to something actually tangible that you make with like glue sticks and paper and pens.
I'm thinking about these people who want to like ban books that cover queer topics and now DEI, right? Like you just push against those things as it relates to people's identity. Are the zines under any threat? Has anybody noticed the zines yet?
They have. I mean, people have noticed the zines, but not in a negative way.
Yeah.
So, and that is the thing. Like in the current political climate, like zines are fairly untraceable. It's just paper. So I think that's maybe one reason that people are returning to zines.
And like you said, you could get one and just make a copy and hand it off to somebody else. What did you call it?
Oh, I did call it a American samizdat. So, samizdat. Yeah.
Samizdat.
So, which is how people like circulated things in the Soviet Union, like music and band literature. So, yeah.
And that's actually a pretty good comparison. For example, the BPL was able to obtain a copy of a zine created by pro-Palestinian organizers at MIT.
They're called Written Revolution. And MIT did like ban and take copies of the zine and destroy it, like MIT management. So, but through a friend that works at MIT Press, he gave me copies of them, and they are in the library's collection.
Oh,
so,
snap. The samizdat.
Yeah.
Tell me about the events, the zine events that you have at the library.
Okay. So there's drop-in zine making 6 to 8 p.m. the second Thursday of every month. This month of April, we're having a zine crawl. So there's a pamphlet you can print out online from any of our websites. If you go to visit these zine libraries, you can get a stamp. And then once you get it stamped, you can be entered into a raffle to win prizes at the end of the month through a short Google form. But but it's more about just like raising awareness that these zine libraries exist. So I would just urge people to check out zines if they haven't before, because there's a whole world of great writing and great resources for you out there.
That's Boston Public Library children's librarian Chris Strunk. And that's our show for today. Thank you so much for listening to The Common, which is produced by myself and Franny Monahan. It's mixed by Marquise Neal, and it's edited by Yasmin Ammer. And our theme music is Me from Hisu. And additional music in this episode is from Intensive Care Unit. I'm your host, Daryl C. Murphy. I'll talk to you next week.
Support for this podcast comes from Is Business Broken, a podcast from BU Questrom School of Business. When the same big investors own shares in competing companies, innovation can suffer. That's why economists Fiona Scott Morton and Glenn Weil propose limiting any firm's investment to 1%. Listen on for a preview of their conversation with host Kurt Nickish.
So critics might argue that limiting ownership stakes to 1%, right, in one competing firm undermines diversification, hurting passive investors, pension funds, that would reduce their low-cost diversification, increase market volatility. You obviously thought of that. Like, how do you respond to those concerns?
That one turns out to be super easy. If you want to diversify your portfolio, you don't actually want to hold 4 airlines. You want an airline, some banking, some consulting, some computer chips, some mines, random, all different kinds of stuff.
You don't need the S&P 500, you maybe need the S&P 100.
You just don't need all 4 airlines. And if you simulate this using past returns, you get almost nothing from holding more than one airline.
Interesting.
And when you look at the very wealthy, what do? They don't even hold all stocks. They're in golf courses and foreign assets, and no one's holding 4 airlines.
How would an institutional investor offer this to customers? How do you imagine that? They're not selling the S&P 500 index fund. They're selling what?
I mean, the way I thought of it by analogy to something like fantasy football. You know, when you have a fantasy football team, obviously you don't just have one of every person in the whole league.
You don't have every running back.
But on the other hand, everyone has a running back. So you would probably pitch yourself in a more differentiated way as we've got R this and R that. It would be much more similar to the way that a conglomerate typically works. You know, in a lot of developing countries, there are conglomerates that have a firm in just about every industry. Mm-hmm. And they're all the Reliance this or the, Tata that or whatever.
Sure.
And I think probably ultimately this would end up with a little bit of that type of a flavor.
Find the full episode by searching for Is Business Broken wherever you get your podcasts, and learn more about the Mehrotra Institute for Business, Markets, and Society at ibms.bu.edu.